to another episode of Test, Optimize, and Scale. Very excited to have Stephanie Jiroch, CEO of BrandPsyche, here with us today.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
And Stephanie, you have a global presence, working with startups, being able to focus on the story and roll that out into customer acquisition, talent acquisition, investor acquisition, being able to do that through creative, looking at pitch decks, emphasizing the value proposition, speaking to our audience directly here, a lot of founders listening in. So, very excited to learn more about the details of your day-to-day now, but figured we could start with your story, with your history.
Yeah. Thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to be here. So I'm CEO of BrandPsyche, as you mentioned. So we are a full stack marketing agency, and we use really the power of story and brand storytelling to drive goals for our founders. So we work from a investor side as well as the customer acquisition side to use that story. And then later, when you're actually hiring, when you get into those later series stage growth levels, we help you actually find the right people and build the culture through your internal story, not the external one. So it has been an interesting journey. I was not planning on working with startups. That wasn't the goal. I started this company almost 4 years ago now. And it kind of just happened by chance. I was living in Singapore at the time. I had worked with some founders prior, but it never had been like my niche, so to speak. And then we were in Singapore, and I kind of got hooked up with this accelerator program out of Singapore for Southeast Asia. And I started working with founders to build out pitch decks and build out stories to raise money. And it just worked perfectly. I mean, it was the perfect marriage, and it was something I had never considered. So that's when I went full in with startups. And since then, we've worked with startups, obviously out of Singapore, UK, France, China. I spent 2 years living in China, so I worked quite a bit there, and then as well as America, North America. So it's been a wild ride, and figuring out how story, can help people make more money, get more money from investors, and then, eventually build their business.
Absolutely. Being able to measure the monetary return of story, not always part of the discussion. So glad you bring that up. I find with entrepreneurs, the numbers are very important. And, the return all has to be part of the working model. So great to see you, point that out. And very fascinated by all of the different geolocations there. I've been to conferences in Hong Kong, so not mainland China. I know you said you were there for 2 years, and in Shanghai, been to conferences in UK, in France, missed a conference in Singapore, but heard that's really a city of the future. How does it contrast doing business in all of these different places? How are you able to adapt from Asia to Europe?
Yeah, it is very different. So in the last 8 years, we've lived in 6 countries. So it's been a wild ride to kind of be on that journey, and hence why I had so many contacts in so many different countries at the time. It was also really great networking, by the way. So, when you go to like France or America, the startup culture, while the ecosystems can be very different in their own right, they're relatively the same. There's a trajectory that you kind of follow usually, from a traditional standpoint, I would say. When you go to Asia, it's like the wild, wild west. I mean, I kind of joke, we landed in America during the pandemic in January, and I kind of had to readjust to being in America and in the startup ecosystem here, where it was like, and especially I'm in a very small town, right? So like the ecosystem here is much smaller than like a Silicon Valley. But at the same time, it would be like, well, we're trying to get seed funding. We've been trying to get seed funding for like 2 years, and we're at about $10,000. And I'm like, sorry, what? Because in Asia, we would go to lunch, with possible investors and walk out with a $2 million check. I mean, it was just, the money was much faster in the Asian markets, probably because also the burn rate is much faster. They go through money much quicker, and the startups die out much faster than I see a lot of ones here. Now, again, it's tech versus product. It's depending on what you're talking about, but it's been an interesting shift. I'm also finding that women in Southeast Asia and China were receiving equal, if not more money, where I find female founders, and the conversation about female founders within Western cultures like America and France, it's a different conversation. And there's a lot more female focused VCs now and funds and accelerators than there are in Southeast Asia and China. So I definitely see some big differences there.
Absolutely. I got to see that firsthand, speaking to Asia and conferences in Thailand, and in South Korea, Japan, as well too. So very interesting to hear about the contrast of different investors there and the startup ecosystem behind it. Also with the female founders, female VCs. Was wondering if you could speak to that a bit more. What do you think are the driving forces there, and how have you seen it show up on your projects?
You mean the driving forces for some of the projects that were in like the Asian markets?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's been really interesting because so in America, and this is obviously so subjective, right? So coming into this environment and seeing, you have some people who come in with products or services that are so passion filled. They've got this amazing thing where they like really have this idea, this amazing passion for this thing that they're trying to do. And then you have on the other side people who saw a really great opportunity and are just going to capitalize on it. In the Asian markets, it wasn't so much about bringing the passion. It wasn't so much like they might have had an interest, but it was more of like, well, this is a smart thing to do. And that's a big driving factor in some of the things that were brought to the table in Southeast Asia and China. As well as there are so many ideas that can be tested early. So that's something to them that's very easy to do. There's a lot of, especially in the tech, the fintech, health tech, I mean, like all the tech, it can be tested very fast and rapidly, especially because the markets are so large. So when I come to America, the testing is much longer, and it sometimes kills the project. But in Southeast Asia, when you can test so fast and you have such a large ability to meet the market and then tell if it's profitable or not within weeks, that was a huge driving factor in how we would get people to market much faster, and the investments, the funding as well. So, you would have lunch again with these people, these private investors who would say, okay, I'm going to write you the check because you showed me within a week that you can get 1 million users and, it's relatively easy to scale. And then boom, it was done. Not saying that those always panned out, but yeah, those were really big driving factors. And for women, it's also very different because in the Asian markets, women, there's a different cultural perspective of women in those markets. So, in China, you always joke that the grandma is the man of the house. Like she's the one who runs. The men think they have the power, but the women actually have it in a lot of the Asian families. And so, women were never seen as lesser than. And so when they asked for funding, they would receive it. I mean, if not more, right? So here there's this, I don't know if that's the same here. It is very different here on that factor. But yeah, from a cultural perspective, the driving factors of who got money were also shaped, the final investment funds.
And I hadn't heard that direct contrast before, but definitely resonates with me. And getting to contrast the passion versus does this make sense? Will this work? How that's reflected with the investors. They're testing it out. They see a return. They're ready to deploy more capital into it. Saw it firsthand in blockchain, various types of digital asset campaigns. We had to exclude U.S. targeting in many of the marketing campaigns where we're looking to bring on high volumes of accredited and or retail investors, depending on whether it's public or private type of offerings. And the way you pointed out, grandma being the head of the household equals, I definitely saw VCs, heads of firms that they're female out there, and just as, if not more effective than some of the firms I see out here. So must be really interesting. And like you said, with your network, it's been said on the show several times, your net worth is your network. So I imagine you have regional partners across the globe at this point.
Yeah, that's been, I think, probably the most unexpected yet fun part of my work is that when we decided to go global as a family, 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago now, I hadn't thought that I would actually build this network like this. Like that wasn't like the goal, right? Like I was like, well, I get to live around the world. Like that's super cool, and here we are today with a network, with people that I can tap into from so many different sources now. And it's been really cool. So yeah.
Absolutely. And so you've been able to build up different partnerships in regards to, I imagine, contractors, press relations, influencers, various types of venture capital groups,
Yeah.
you name it, in these different areas. Have you found that being able to connect those dots with clients just makes it that much more adopted and in a quicker period of time for initiatives in those given areas?
Yeah, good
You've seen
question.
accelerated timeline as a result?
Yeah, I have actually. At the same time, depending on depending on the culture, there can actually be more delays. So while I have seen, the ability to connect people across continents and facilitate and sit in on deals, or even just collaborations that maybe not would have happened before, right, is an amazing thing. At the same time, depending on the culture and the nuances of how they work, I have seen some delays that can show up as well. I have seen some miscommunication that can easily happen, in not understanding a tone, or getting offended easily. So that also, it's from a cultural standpoint, it's been interesting, because while the systems and processes can work really well, the cultural side of it still plays into how the work and the relationship within the work is done. So there's kind of a weird dance that always happens with that. You can create every system and process in the world. You can coordinate, you can make, you can facilitate conversations, but at the end of the day, those cultures sometimes still clash a little bit, and then smoothing that over to build, maybe a good collaboration or investment opportunity is kind of the goal. But yeah, it is a two-step in a way.
Sure. So I want to get to story later, back to how you adopt it for different markets.
Hmm.
But there's so many different approaches to it. To say it's an art versus a science, I think is an understatement. How
Yeah.
do you approach the development of the story, of storytelling?
Yeah. So I'm a total story geek. Like, I love stories. I love writing. I've always been a writer. Like, I was a ghostwriter for 10 years, back in my 20s. And that's how I basically paid my way through my 20s, was ghostwriting for these, really cool people. And I decided to get my MA in media psychology. So I went and got my master's in media psychology. I had a background in journalism and psychology, so it kind of worked out really well. And now I'm getting my PhD, actually. So I'm a semester away from candidacy, so nearly there. But
Congrats.
thank you. But I focus on stories. So the big thing is, one, how does story persuade us? How does story evoke an emotion and then get us to actually click buy now, or watch more, or learn more, or whatever? And then what is the ROI on that story? Can we actually start to track that? Because what I see is that most startups, most founders, especially if they're like a one-man shop, one-woman shop in the beginning, they do not want to invest in marketing. And I always see that as their downfall, is because they never want to put money towards marketing for the first couple years. They always think they can bootstrap it. They always think they can do it themselves. And when they do that, because they're not marketers, they're not telling stories, they're not telling effective stories, they're not getting people interested in the product or the technology, but they're probably selling, they're using some really good bullet points, here's what we do, but there's no emotional draw to it. And the beauty of story is in the emotion. That's why we love movies, that's why we love books. I mean, that's the whole point, right? So my draw to story was really in, how does evoking emotion then persuade us to purchase? And that's where that beautiful little sweet spot of, yeah, we talk about brand storytelling, it sounds cool on LinkedIn. We talk about marketing, yeah, we know we need it, right? But like, how does it mesh together to actually create results that drive, pitch decks? When you go in and you pitch something, it's not just what they're getting in return. It's not the equity. It's not the possible benefits of whatever you're selling. It's not how you can scale it per se in the beginning. A lot of it draws from, well, why does this actually interest me? What draws me to actually investing, giving you enough money? Yeah, I might get a return on it, but there's always an emotional part to it. So how do we draw that out a little bit more? How do we tell a better story? And then from the customer acquisition side, it's like, well, how are we telling a story to get people to actually like us, buy from us, use our product, use our tech, and then catching those stories on the back end. And so there's a lot there around how story can then actually move the company forward, and not just, well, check off the box, we have social media, check off the box, we have blogs, we have SEO, we have a website. You need all those things, but the story is the thing that kind of like draws it all together. And then you tell that story across the channels, and people are like, I want to be part of that story. Like, I like that story. I see myself in that story. I'm inspired, I'm empowered, whatever it is. And boom, like, you've got a customer. And the whole point is you want a loyal customer. You want someone who comes back and continues to use the platform, or buy the product or whatever, right? I don't buy Nike shoes because I run. I buy Nike shoes because they make me feel really good about the fact that I could run. Like, I still have Nike shoes in the box. Like, I don't run, but I like the idea of it, right? And so that's why Nike wins the day, over, other brands. No offense if you like other brands, but they're probably the best example.
And what a great example of that. It's like you said, being able to see yourself in the brand,
Yep.
being able to ask, why would the audience, be it an investor or a consumer, be interested? What about that storyline? What evokes the emotion? I used to say people don't necessarily like individuals for their personality at the first step. They like how they make them feel. And they remember what they said in the conversation. They remember that emotion during the dynamic. People like people, don't want to overstate that part, but the emotions really were pointed out to me from a psychological standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So, so many of my finance vertical discussions are around, hey, what are the deal points? What type of return are we going to see right away? And it's like you said, can check all the boxes about what we're doing, but if we're not basing it on a solid story that really captivates the audience, they could see themselves in it, they're the hero in that story, they're able to, continue adopting that into their own identity, into their own next steps, not to get too philosophical. But if that's not there, I could tell you from the advertising side, the primary thing we do in our agency, I could drive 1 million people to an offering and I'm not going to see the performance.
Yeah.
Where if we're basing it on something that's resonating, if we're basing it on something that's going to work, and a fraction of those individuals have awareness, we're still going to see, an exponentially stronger result.
Mm-hmm.
I really love how you point out the evoking emotion part. Do you have any tips around that? Do you have any stories that you can share on, how to evoke emotion? Because I believe it's one of those things that's easier said than done. There could be a period of testing involved, and it can be difficult for some brands, given their vertical, to really produce an emotional response.
Yeah, for sure. So, and it depends on, it depends on who your audience is. So there you go, right? That whole idea of the niche. But one of the things you mentioned in the beginning was the art or the science of story. And the cool thing is it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of that yin and yang, right? So, and just to back up and understand why that works, to then give you the tactics to do that, is that, when we hear stories from a science side, our brain does something called neural coupling. So we hear a story and we're emotionally involved in it, and then we actually neural couple. So the way that the brain works is it hears what's happening. Like, let's say you're watching a movie, you're watching this story play out, and we actually feel it, see it, think it, hear it as if we are experiencing it, because our brain is neural coupling. So with neural coupling, the cool thing is when you're watching something, our brain acts as if we're in it. And that's what you get with any great marketing story as well. So it's not just a 90-minute film that you watch at the movie theater. It can be a 30-second ad. And the cool thing is we have visual, words, sound to make that story come to life, right? So it doesn't have to be just a linear model anymore, like reading a book and using your imagination. We have all these different elements that can make the story very real. So if you can have your customer neural couple with your brand, it's been shown that brand loyalty, awareness, love, affinity actually grows, because they've basically neural couple, they've linked their brain with your story, which is an amazing opportunity to take advantage of. So when you ask me how do we actually do that? What are ways to do that? One of the ways you can test your story is to create multiple mini chunks of a story. So it depends if you are a founder. Let's say you're using a founder story in a pitch deck. There might be 3 or 4 different stories that you can test depending on the pitch. There might be the emotionally based story. There might be the rags to riches story. There might be the, Goliath, David and Goliath story. You can use different story frameworks to test which one maybe inspires, empowers, invokes, calls to action somebody to say, hey, I'm actually paying attention to this. no story is going to work 100% of the time. There's always going to be somebody who didn't, particularly like your story. That's okay. That it never happens that it's 100%. But you can test out your different types of stories with people to see which one is producing the best effect. If you're talking or pitching to a bunch of investors who have their own rags to riches story, you might use a rags to riches story to say, hey, I'm like you, I'm with you. And then they kind of get evoked because they remember their story. So there's some really cool ways that you can use story frameworks. Another very cool thing you can do is, like, let's say you're running ads and this, is you use hooks. Like, what kind of hooks are you going to use? We call them hooks in my agency. And basically, how are you starting it out so you grab their attention? And that's basically A/B testing. If you're testing different headlines on emails, if you're testing different headlines in ads, you're basically doing an A/B test. You're doing hook tests. You're seeing which one grabs the attention more. And depending again on your audience, if you're doing customer acquisition side, your hook is going to be very different than hooking an investor. Right? So you want to make sure that those headlines actually match up to the right base instead of trying to use them across the board. So, a big recommendation is never try to use the same language with multiple niches or target markets. And this, but just for the people listening, it's good to always kind of remind yourself, like, you need to switch it up depending on who you're speaking to. Otherwise, the story won't resonate in the same way and you're not going to get the same results.
Yeah, and I love how you brought up the advertising example, because that's how we A/B test, market test at that, where we'll often start with 4 to 10 audiences. Personalized messaging is the goal, but definitely messaging that's customized for each of those audiences.
Yeah.
We then want to variant test multiple creatives with that, which can include the messaging. And we're looking for, in the analytics, a stronger click-through rate, a stronger conversion rate. I try to use a lot of offline, online analogies. So I'll speak to a founder about the messaging that they use that has the other side of the table's eyes pop open.
Yeah.
What gets the prospective investor, the individual prospective customer that they're speaking to offline, the most excited? What evokes that emotional response? How can we compact that into the copy of an advertisement, which is difficult to do. We follow this method of the 313 method from Ryan Poland, TEDx Talks. I've had him on the show as well, where you break the story, the product, the value to the audience down into 3 sentences, then 1 sentence, then 3 words. If we can do it in that type of brief, grabbing fashion where the audience could feel like they understand it, in a few words, that's powerful. For us, we try to take it to the point where the audience can then be the storyteller based on the language that we're using. So testing out those different emotional responses, like you mentioned, and having one framed for each, we find a streamlined fashion to approach that with the advertising. So really glad you're able to bring that up. Want to talk about how that lives in a pitch deck as well too. And I've spent countless hours working on pitch decks from all sides of the table. Was at a social gaming startup here in Santa Monica back in 2009 through 2011. Firsthand created about 75 different versions of the pitch deck, both for edits that consultants, advisors had recommended, also to customize for the audiences that we were pitching, which it was license holders for social gaming, leveraging licenses with over 1 million followers on Facebook at the time. So constantly redrafting. How do you formulate the story into the pitch deck? How do you communicate the value proposition there? And what do edits thereafter look like?
Yeah, great question. And I always tell whenever we work with founders on this, and even just regular clients, who come in and want other marketing services, not just pitch decks. The story is an evolutionary process, just like a pitch deck, just like your business. A lot of people come in and they say, well, we're going to get the story and then that story is going to be the story, or, this pitch deck is going to be the pitch deck. And I'm like, it will have iterations, until you decide to close that business, until you decide, you will always have iterations and an evolutionary process in this. You know what I mean? So So never think it's done. It's always a work in progress. So I always say that to start. And I can't promise that it'll always be in concrete. So the beautiful thing in a pitch deck is when we start to use the pitch deck in a story framework, one of the ways that our agency does it is we take the story framework, so hook, very much Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. We have shifted from that because I worked on my thesis a little bit in the way that values actually show up in that, and then how that comes back to the community, because we saw that missing in that journey. So one of the things we do is we've added in a few more things in that, but we take that journey, the hook, the call to action, the issue, how you as the brand come in to solve whatever problem it is to be the go-to solution, right? So very much the guide in that. And then we move through the different phases of, the peaks and valleys of that plot or theme of that story. So we use that, and then we take the pitch deck and we basically lay it out underneath that. And we basically create a pitch deck underneath that journey, which is not typical. We've seen, you and I have probably seen thousands of pitch decks probably at this point combined. And there's been some that are super succinct and very benefits driven, and, finances are on point, and there's no story at all, maybe other than just like, hi, I'm the founder. There's really nothing in it that leads me to understand what the company or concept even, values or considers. And then there's others that are too much story and a little too fluff, and you need to actually have some concrete things in that. And so we have to have, again, that dance of those two. And so when we, start to work on the value proposition, we look at that at the very beginning of the pitch deck, because we want those values laced in to everything else. So all the hard numbers, all the benefits, everything that you're doing to build that long-term vision and goal to get the money you need to eventually possibly do whatever you want to do with this company, sell it, grow it, whatever. We want to make sure that the values are clear, so that way they say, oh, here's the money. No, you don't need to ask me twice. Because otherwise, yes, benefits sell, but I don't go buy my car that I have in my garage because it's the best car on the lot for the benefits that it provides. All the cars pretty much do the same thing. I do it because that particular brand of car made me feel a certain way, right? Because that brand has advertisements that speak to a certain value proposition. So it's like, if I'm driving that, I align with that in a very weird subconscious way. Even if cars aren't important, it still is the way that our brain works to say, well, wait a minute, hold on, right? Like, I don't know if I want to be aligned with that. And so we do that in the very beginning of our pitch decks, and we set the tone right from the start.
And do you see a consistent length for pitch decks? Do you see a consistent table of contents for pitch decks? Just trying to picture the flow of some of these documents.
Yeah, the length varies, also depending on what series and stage we're talking about. I was working on a pitch deck recently that was about 20 slides. It was fantastic, phenomenal. She was in her Series B round. We were working on drawing in more of the story into it, because now what was happening is that she got her Series A, but in Series B, she needed to prove the story now. So how do we do that? Well, we get customer reviews. We talk about, we use the customer's words to really showcase why it's actually working, because the idea in the beginning of this particular client was that nobody's going to want to buy this. Turns out everyone really wanted to buy it. It was a big hit. So now she's going to use customers' own words to, showcase that next round. So we were using it in that way. Lengthwise, I've seen some that are 10, but I haven't seen a lot of success with 10s unless it's a concept that can be proved. Like in China, I saw a couple 10s, but again, that was more of who you knew to get that investment. It wasn't like you were pitching cold. So I think it also depends again on that audience. So 10 to 20 is usually what I've seen. I've seen 50, 60 slides. I'm sure you've seen probably, depending on, again, also what you're putting out there. What I have seen though, is that most of the time it swings hard on the numbers, which it should, depending on the industry, it can, but it usually swings too low on why it matters. So why, like, what is the impact? What is the value? Like, yeah, sometimes you get a slide with like a tagline, or sometimes you get a slide being like, we really value community or something. But there's no emotion driving that. And so I often tell my founders, well, why don't we start with like, why does this particular cause matter to you? And so when you look at the table of contents, while you'll always have kind of, who we are, the team, the finances, what we do, a lot of times what's missing inside that space is, well, why are we here? Like why are we doing this in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's a big factor.
The meanings behind it for the team, for the audience that's listening to it. How do you see this reformatted for a group in Paris or London or Singapore or Shanghai? Is it generally the same document? Are there, language translation differences that you're putting in?
Yeah.
Or is the audience really more of one geo target for any of these initiatives?
Yeah, really great question. So the cool thing about story is it can be used across culture. So it's kind of like this one size fits all model, right? All of our brains work the same way. Language changes that, of course. The way that our brain works changes with the type of language we speak, which is very fascinating in its own right. But story works nonetheless. Now, what's interesting is that what I found in the Asian markets is that story has a very different template, though, from some angles compared to Western stories. In Asia, stories were much shorter. There was a sense of we didn't want to share too much personal information in Asia because there was a sense of privacy there that's very highly regarded.
Mm.
So we had to work our way around value propositions that supported the emotional draw. Whereas when I've worked with people out of the UK and France, it's water over rocks. It's the same system that I would use here in North America. And it was easy. It's easy to implement there. But yeah, there are some slight differences from a cultural standpoint. The good thing is, though, when you use emotion evoked storytelling to sell, whether that's to an investor or to a customer, it works either way. I mean, it's not like it's going to go dead because nobody knows what a story is and nobody likes to go to the movies. Our brains and our emotions all work in a very similar way. So it works. It's just how do you use it in certain tones and themes for the culture that they say, oh, I want to be a part of that. And it does change.
Really remarkable how you're able to bring in these cultural, psychological elements into the whole process. Do you see it reflected in the pitch itself? Do you coach on pitching of this document, of this pitch deck? As I know, there's different time frames that founders are often asked to pitch in. I see pitch competitions where it can be a couple minutes, 10 minutes. Have definitely seen conferences where founders take the stage for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, various different time points. Do you see the story elaborate in those type of circumstances? Do you have guidelines for that, for those inquiries from clients?
Yeah, another great question that you have. So we have an internal document that helps us support people whenever they're doing some sort of pitch competition, a speech, for example, too, as well. So we'll take pitch decks and reformulate them if they're doing like a TEDx, if they have to speak at a conference or something, we can formulate that. Pitch competitions are really interesting, by the way. So when we were working with Singapore, a Singapore hub and their accelerator program, the pitches were 3 minutes. And they would compete in rounds, obviously, in this accelerator to practice and get ahead and all the things, right? And what we found is that in those moments, leading with the value proposition with a very strong hook tend to get them to the round faster. Now, this is obviously not empirical evidence by any means. I'm not coming here with statistics and numbers. You can tell my researcher brain is wait a minute, I can't promise you anything. But what I did see was that there was a higher propensity for people who were using value propositions in the beginning that then immediately went into the benefits instead of driving with benefits first. So when they started with an engaged question or something that made you think right off the bat, any sort of hook that got you that caught your attention, and those hooks are usually value-based. Sometimes they weren't, but 9 out of 10, they were value-based. They're what would you do if kind of questions, right? And then you'd say, I don't know. And then they would pitch into the benefits of whatever it is they were selling. You're like, oh, snap, good job. I found that they actually went ahead much farther than the ones who would say here's what we do. Here's how we sell it. We need $5 million. You know what I mean? And you're like, not quite it.
Less emotions being evoked there.
Yeah, not a lot going on that. But, I think the best ideas too, and I've seen this so many times, and you might have as well. I have seen brilliant ideas come out of people that don't know how to share that story, that don't know how to communicate effectively what it is they're trying to bring into the world. And so they don't get the funding, they don't get the support. And it's such a bummer when I see that, because I'll see things across my desk in pitches that I'm like, whoa, right? Like there is so much promise here. Like, and people bring something where you're like, I would have never come up with that. And thank God you did, because that's not my expertise. But then, because they weren't able to share that effectively, because they had problems telling that story to people, they never got it out there. And that to me is just such a bummer. So
Sure. And it sounds like you've had a lot of success stories with this as well too. Being able to start with the story, putting it into the pitch deck, watching that, then conveyed through the pitch itself, and have gone on to see groups that you work with hit their next milestones. You mentioned a B round. Any that you can share, even without naming names, of some of the paths that your clients have been able to follow?
yeah. So there's one in particular that I've got a lot of love for, based out of Singapore. I won't share their name, but I was with them. What was it now? Well, that was 2017. So a few years ago. And so I worked on their first pitch deck. I was with them from the very beginning when they only had like 3 people, and they were doing their first kind of seed rounds. And they were just a great little company and great people. They actually just exited. They got a buyout for a couple million. I think it was like 5 or 6 million that they got for each one of their buyouts. So they each got that, and that was great. And they're happy with it. And they basically, it was absolved into a larger company based out of the Southeast Asia region, and they're really stoked, and they're off to build their next thing. So I feel like that's such a beautiful thing to see. It is like their ability to start small and actually do what they wanted to do with the company is just phenomenal. And I'm still in contact with them. And so that's also really cool to just hear their, evolution. And that's the thing, right? Again, it's an evolution. So the company is an evolution. The story is an evolution. The story I made for them in that first pitch deck is not the same story they had at the end of the day, right? It grew, it evolved. That brand has its own life. The business, the thing had its own life at that point, and you have to let it have its own life. You can't force it into being what it was or what you think it should be. It needs to grow on its own. And so to be able to see that evolution of a brand or a business is a very cool thing. And I think when you think about scaling story, when you think about how can I make this work in the long haul, one of the cool things you do is you let your customer have the story. You let your people, you let your team have the story. Stop trying to own the story of your business when you get to a certain point. Let everyone else have that and contribute to the overall theme of whatever it is you created. Because if you don't, it'll die out. You're just gonna you're gonna smother it.
How is it repeated from there? How's the story told? And hearing about that exit, wow, that really shows the power of these tools. Really adds to that story. And I'm taking notes, things I want to share with my team, myself. For the audience, want to go over a few different recommendations. If you could provide any type of actionable insights, and want to start with the early stage. What could they test in terms of the creation of their story, the development of their pitch deck, the rollout of this whole concept? Do you have any recommendations for what listeners could test?
Yeah, so start with different types of stories. So, think of like David and Goliath, I talked about, the tortoise and the hare. Like, think about kind of some of your favorite fables or fairy tales and the themes inside those stories. And then consider, does my company fit inside that? Are we out to fight the bad guy? We're the little one that's going to win. Are we going to take it slow and steady and win the race? Like, it's very cliche, but that's, our brains work well in cliches. So kind of take a moment if you're just starting out and say, well, how do we want this story to play out? Are we going to be the ones that are consistent, are strong, are reliable? Are we going to be the ones that are a little bit of troublemakers, like Dennis the Menace? Are we going to be more of that kind of princess story, right? Where everything works out in the end, but we had our trials. So start to consider the theme of your story first. That kind of sets the tone for how you want to grow, how you want to hire, how you want to talk about your company with other people, how you want to position yourself. Because really that's what it is. If I'm a rebel brand, I'm not catering to the ones who like to play safe, right? Like, I'm definitely one who's going to be like, I'm going to invoke you and be like, yo, let's be rebels together. Like, come over to our side, right? Like, come and check us out. And so you want to kind of use that. The next stage personally is building out the story. So you want to make sure you're building out something like, what's the hook? Why are people there? You know, why are people at your company? Why are people wanting to use your tech? You know, what is it? And not just because, well, it makes people's lives easier. Maybe, I don't know if that's really true or not, right? But like, what is the thing? You know, are you giving them back 5 minutes to be with their kids? Are you organizing their day so they can reach their next financial marker? You know, whatever it is. And then the next thing is, what's your conflict? So my clients hate this conversation, and it takes weeks to get through it with them usually, because you always want to talk about the benefits and the solutions. You want to say, here's how we make your life better, but you never want to talk about the conflict. When you, and this is the biggest kind of like insider tip. If you can speak to your target market's conflict, it shows that you understand them and you have empathy for what they're going through. And that target market will come to respect you and see you as the go-to solution. So if you're glossing over the conflict just to jump to the solution in anything, whether that's a pitch deck or if you're doing an Instagram post and you only talk about how you solve the problem, they don't know if you really get what the problem is. But if you can go into the problem, you know, whatever it is you're selling, if you can go in to say, hey, I get it. I've been there. We get you. We're here to do this exact thing for you because we know how much that sucks for you. Then they say, oh, yes, I've been looking for this. They totally get me, right? And then they buy, or they sign up for the free trial, or they get on the newsletter list. And so that's my biggest, you know, next stage is look at the conflict. What is it there that you're trying to actually get through to them? Because we all want to be the solution,
Right.
but we have a really hard time expressing what the actual problem is without sounding like Debbie Downers. So you don't need to say the world's coming to an end, but you definitely need to touch on it. So, you know, those are kind of the three primary things: is look at how you want to show up, so you position, look at how you're hooking people, you know, kind of the story that you're starting to tell people, and then also, you know, share with them the conflict and get clear on the conflict and be able to express that conflict.
And I think people appreciate transparency. They don't want to be sold. So, you know, I could speak to my own day-to-day conversations, and if I'm speaking to a founder and I'm talking about the inherent risks of marketing, you know, how the percentages aren't necessarily there for them hitting their goals, but tactics that we've found to support in that, you know, some of the downfalls with agencies, and not to talk just too much about it, but to have some material to relate. I say, you know, I've been on all sides of the table. We've set up 3, you know, core values to be easy to work with, to communicate early, and to answer with algorithms. And I feel that allows them to connect, for them to click, for them to see there's nothing behind the curtain, in the sense that, you know, there's no magic. It's good processes. It's applying our experiences and data, and that's how we're able to achieve these results. And I find through that transparency, there's far more trust. It's a far more productive relationship. I could see an analogy of that to consumer brands. I could see an analogy of that to an investor conversation. So I think being able to lead, to, you know, have that, maybe not lead, but have that conflict featured. We'll often say feature the flaw is a big deal, and can be measured in the response rates from there. I like the format here: theme or position, you know, what's the hook, what's the conflict, really good things to be thinking about. Again, going to be sharing this with different people in my network to talk about in conversations even today. Want to talk about a tougher topic: what do you do when it's not working? Optimization. So, you know, we don't want to say, hey, quit, stop what you're doing, the goals aren't going to be hit. We also don't want to continue behavior, continue a story perhaps that isn't working. What have you seen to be most productive in terms of optimizations?
Yeah, I kind of touched on this before, but I've seen a lot of founders, C-level, you know, depending on what stakeholders coming to the conversation, there is this innate fear in some of them to pivot. So if something's not working, there is this fear and delay in making the decision to change it up, to do something different, right? If something's not landing correctly, usually though, and I've seen this too, if a story's not landing, we either have the wrong target market, so we've been talking to the wrong person completely, or the conversations that have been had with the founders are from what they think they should say to me, not what they actually want to build. So, those are very clear things from our side when we see failure, is that, okay, we're obviously not talking to the right person, because if the story doesn't land, there's something, we're missing something there, because the process is pretty foolproof to a certain degree. But then, okay, cool, let's pivot. Let's change that. Either we change the target market, we change the person that we're talking to, or we change the story. And I've seen time after again, people being like, well, we need to talk about that. Like, I don't know. Like, they want to play it safe. And there's this aversion to risk of the pivot. But I tell them, if you pivot early, no harm, no foul. Like, we learn, we have to test that, right? So when you're optimizing the story, when we're shifting through social change, political year, pandemic, like, when you have these things, you have to be able to speak to the situation and not just say, well, I don't know yet. I don't know. Let's see what other people do first, right? Like, let's see how they handle it. Safety in numbers isn't always the best way to go. Like, say, holding yourself back isn't always the best way. So whenever we're optimizing, whenever we're testing, whenever we're saying, hey, this didn't work, we always have to look at, okay, let's throw something else on the wall and see what works, with tact and agility and ability to say, hey, we didn't hit that right. And we're going to try again, because the idea of playing it safe, just, I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me, but I get it. That's my own subjective.
And so let's say, they have that agility, they get
Mhm.
it working. Now they're hitting their different milestones. Maybe it's on the investment side and they get some anchor investors in.
Mhm.
Maybe it's more customer acquisition oriented,
Yep.
and they're hitting different user
Mhm.
revenue milestones. How does this all scale? How can the story, continue to evolve for larger audiences?
Yeah. So the cool thing about story is that it spreads. So if you can get spreaders, and this on the marketing side, if you can get spreaders, boom, like you're good. You know what I mean? Like, we want spreaders. And so you want to be able to have a story that's shareable. So really, a story that's shareable is your ability to scale. If it's not shareable, if you're trying to make it a static story, one dimensional, like it just doesn't hold anything, like you want to have it like plaqued on a wall somewhere, then you're not going to scale and it's not going to go anywhere, and good luck. You know what I mean? Like, have a good life. But if you allow your story to be shareable, if you allow it to kind of like, almost like, what is it? Like, what is that? Play-Doh? You know what I mean? Like, you kind of have to mold it. You have to work with it. Like, you have to let it kind of like do its thing instead of trying to make it into something. Then you have an opportunity to make it something bigger than yourself. And a lot of founders struggle, and I don't want to generalize too much. Some of the founders that I've worked with have struggled with building something that is beyond them. The idea of it sounds good. That's why they're in it, right? That's why they're there trying to get money. But then when they actually have to let it go and like let the thing like breathe on its own, it's like this, like, and they hold on tighter, right? It's like helicopter parenting or something, I think they call it
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Right? I don't know. I'm not sure. So like, it's that idea of like, what are you doing right now? And you're like, can you just give it a minute? Like, let it do its thing. So if you allow it to be shareable, and if you allow, like I said before, people to own parts of that story. We saw this. What was this? When was that? Wasn't it? Was it YouTube who like were like super anti, like, don't download our music like illegally or whatever that whole situation was, like 10 years ago. Sorry, I might be dating myself here. But like,
Metallica.
basically, yeah, was that it? So like they were like anti, like super anti, like, you can't download our music off, like, da 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 da, it's ours, or like, we have the rights. And I get that. I get that conversation. At the same time, when you allow the people to own and control part of that story that you've created and make it their own and allow them to be super fans in that own right, you've got 10 times more in the return on that than you do by owning the rights to a song. You see what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, and I'll get pushback on this by some people I know, but like, this idea of allowing it to grow beyond you is really important if you actually want to bring something to life and have long-term impact. You know, we always tell our founders, if you want to build the legacy, you have to allow it to grow on its own. You have to let it have its own life. In that way, you can't be irresponsible about it. You have to navigate conversations and narratives in the media and be ahead. How you want to create a culture, that's a narrative, you know, who you want to hire. At the same time, you do have to allow it to be owned by other people so that way it can grow beyond you.
What a great way to paint that picture. And, you know, I was first taught by our CFO, speaking to the business as a whole, to picture the entity as a living, breathing,
Yes.
sitting in the chair next to us at the table thing. So how appropriate to envision the story of the brand itself to take on that same type of dynamic, and to picture it in the audience's narrative. You know, when I'm talking about brands that I like, if I'm talking about my iPhone, I'm not repeating Tim Cook. I'm not saying, hey, check out this video, although I'm a fan and I watch the premieres. I am really applying it to my own identity. I'm creating my own story with it. I'm talking about the features myself. The example you used of Nike in the past. And for me, it's Vans. I grew up skateboarding, have friends in the snowboard industry over, in the departments there at Vans, so I get firsthand different insights in some of the products. But it's not their voice; it's mine. Being able to talk about how that product interacts with my hobby, with my life, how it can be adopted by whoever I'm speaking to. So leaving room for that, not helicopter parenting, but allowing for Play-Doh to be designed in the fashion that the audience wants to create.
I mean, could you imagine going up to it like let's say you're out and you see a guy wearing Vans and you're like, nope, you can't wear them that way. Like, that's not how it's done. And then you're like, what? You know what I mean? And he could be totally different than you. He could be so opposite of you, but he's got his version of that brand in his life and you've got yours. And I think it can be said on the C-level side as well. And on the VC side as well. It's like, there's this desire to control it and to almost like kind of wring it out for what we can get the most out of it. But what we don't realize, it is a living, breathing thing in the lives of the consumers or the people who are using it, right? So it's like understanding that and then remembering that you need to come at the product or service or tech that way can really help enhance the brand in the long run, and possibly even, expand you into different markets, expand you into different spaces that you never envisioned prior if you had tried to control that.
Absolutely. And Stephanie, these are amazing recommendations, amazing insights. If anybody wants to talk with you directly, continue the conversation, look at some of these formulas, what's the best way for them to get in contact? What's your preferred method of communication?
Yeah, well, head to my website. So it's BrandPsyche, BrandPsyche.co. So .co. And just hang out over there. We got a form. You can fill it out. You can talk to me. We'll set up an interview or a time to consult, and we'll just chill. So we can talk about all sorts of fun things.
And I would certainly recommend that. Don't normally endorse guests, but I would certainly recommend that. Can have some of my team members follow up here too. Stephanie Jiroch, everybody, thank you for being here with us today.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. It was good.
All right. See everybody next time.